I never imagined that the sound of polished shoes echoing across a marble floor could weigh so heavily on my chest. Yet that morning, as I stepped into the courthouse, every step felt like a drumbeat against my ribs. My palms were damp, my throat tight, and though I had rehearsed this moment in my mind for weeks, I knew nothing could prepare me for what was about to unfold. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. Lawyers rushed past me, with folders clutched to their chests. Secretaries whispered hurriedly, and the hum of fluorescent lights added to the nervous energy vibrating in the air. I walked slower than the rest, not because I wanted to, but because my legs felt heavy, as if they carried not just my weight, but the weight of my entire past. I paused outside courtroom 3. My reflection stared back at me in the narrow glass panel of the door. A face that looked calm enough, almost ordinary, but behind those eyes lived decades of silence, grief, and unanswered questions. No one in this building knew who I really was. Not the bailiff who glanced at me indifferently, not the lawyers shuffling papers, not even the relatives who had gathered in the back rows to watch the trial unfold, and certainly not the judge when I entered. The courtroom stilled for just a second, like a church when a stranger walks in during prayer. I took a seat near the front, folding my hands to hide the trembling in my fingers. My eyes drifted to the raised bench where the judge would soon sit. The bench looked imposing, carved of dark oak, polished to a shine, but it wasn't the wood that made my stomach twist. It was what I knew deep down about the man who would sit there. The judge, my blood. I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat nearly choking me. For years, I had imagined this day, wondering if fate would ever bring us face to face, wondering if, when that moment came, I would feel anger, grief, or forgiveness. I had carried his absence like a scar that refused to fade. And now, in a matter of minutes, he would walk through that door and take his seat, unaware that the child he had abandoned decades ago was sitting only feet away. The bailiff called for order, and the chatter subsided. My heart pounded so loud I was afraid others could hear it. Then the door creaked open behind the bench, and he entered. The judge was taller than I remembered from photographs, his frame still straight despite his age. His hair was gray now, but his eyes, sharp, piercing, unyielding, were unmistakable. He carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect. The room rose as one, the ritual of standing for the judge, and I rose with them, though my knees nearly buckled. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the courtroom with the calm detachment of a man used to holding power. But then his gaze landed on me. For a moment, he froze. His lips parted ever so slightly. His hand hesitated above the gavel, and the mask of authority he wore so effortlessly cracked. It was just a flicker so brief that no one else seemed to notice. But I noticed. I felt it like a lightning bolt striking me right through the chest. He knew. The judge had recognized me. And in that instant, the years collapsed. I was no longer the grown man I appeared to be. I was the child left behind. The boy who had stared at the door waiting for someone who never returned. I was the echo of every unanswered question, every silent night, every ache my mother had tried to hide. The courtroom was silent, but inside me, a storm raged. He cleared his throat, straightened his back, and slammed the gavel lightly against the block. "Court is now in session," he said, his voice steady, yet I could still see the faint tremor in his eyes. The ghost of recognition he could not disguise. No one else knew the truth. Not the jury, not the attorneys, not the witnesses waiting nervously to be called. But I knew. He knew, and before this trial ended, the entire courtroom would know who I really was. As the proceedings began, I sat quietly, pretending to be just another face in the crowd. The defense attorney shuffled papers, the prosecutor cleared his throat, and the jury shifted in their seats, some already looking tired though the day had barely started. To them, I was nobody, an observer, a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place, perhaps. But I wasn't a stranger. Not to him. Not to the man behind the bench who was trying so hard to hide the panic in his eyes. I kept my gaze steady on him, though I tried to make it appear casual. Every flick of his wrist, every tap of the gavel, every time his eyes avoided mine, I saw it all. He was unsettled, though no one else seemed to notice. He was a man trained to command authority, yet authority was slipping from his grasp. Moment by moment, as my presence gnawed at him. I wondered if he was replaying the past as fiercely as I was. Did he remember the small boy whose voice once called out his name? Did he remember the silence that followed when he never answered? Did he know the long nights my mother cried herself to sleep, clutching a photograph that grew more worn with every passing year? The judge cleared his throat again, his voice faltering for just a heartbeat before resuming its practiced steadiness. He called the first witness to the stand, and the routine of law and order unfolded as though nothing were amiss. But beneath the surface, there was tension thick, unspoken, dangerous. I shifted in my seat, the wooden bench creaking beneath me. A woman in front glanced back with annoyance, but I barely noticed her. My mind drifted to the years that had led me here, to this courtroom, to this moment of silent confrontation. For most of my life, my father had been a ghost. My mother never spoke his name, not even in anger. All I had were fragments, a birth certificate with his signature, a few photographs tucked in a showbox, whispers from distant relatives who refused to say too much. He had vanished when I was barely old enough to form memories, leaving behind nothing but questions that ate at me like hunger. Growing up, I told myself I didn't need him, that I was strong without him. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I would lie awake imagining what it might have been like if he had stayed. Would he have taught me to ride a bike? Would he have been there when I graduated? Would he have put his arm around my mother instead of leaving her to raise me alone? Instead, all I had was absence, a void so deep it shaped who I became. And now, here he was, not a ghost, not a whisper, not a faded photograph, but flesh and blood, robed in authority, elevated above us all as if he were untouchable. My father, my judge. I clenched my fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. Rage rose inside me, but so did something else, fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what would happen when the truth came out. Because it would come out. Secrets this heavy cannot stay buried forever. The witness spoke, the attorneys argued, the jury scribbled notes. It all blurred together, meaningless noise against the pounding of my heart. I wasn't here for the trial they were conducting. I was here for the trial of a lifetime, one that existed between me and the man who had given me life, then stolen so much of it by walking away. At one point, he looked at me again. Just a flicker, a glance so quick most people would have missed it. But in that glance I saw something I had never expected. Regret. It was there, buried deep in his eyes, fighting against the wall of composure he had built over decades. Regret and fear. My breath caught. For years I had dreamed of confronting him, of demanding answers, of shouting until my voice broke. But now, as he sat in judgment of others, it struck me that he was already on trial. Not in the eyes of the jury, not in the eyes of the law, but in mine, and perhaps in his own. The gavel struck again, calling order to the courtroom. Yet inside me, chaos reigned. No one here knew who I really was. No one knew that the man sitting on the bench was not just a judge, but a father who had turned his back on his child. But they would. Before this trial ended, the world would know the truth. I can still remember the sound of my mother's voice on those long winter nights. It wasn't the words she spoke, because most of the time, she said nothing at all, but the silence that filled the room when she thought I was asleep. Silence heavy enough to crush a child's chest. Silence that screamed louder than any argument could. I was 6 years old the first time I asked her why my father never came home. She froze, her hands still wet from washing dishes, the sponge dripping onto the floor. For a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me. Then she turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Some people just don't know how to stay." That was all she gave me. A single sentence. I clung to it for years, twisting it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Some people just don't know how to stay. Did that mean he wanted to stay but couldn't? Or that he left because he didn't love us enough? I used to sit on the front porch for hours, waiting for headlights to appear at the end of the street. Every car that passed made my heart leap, only for it to sink again when it kept going. I imagined him walking up the path with gifts, with apologies, with arms wide open. But the driveway stayed empty, and the porch grew colder as the seasons passed. My mother tried her best. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to keep food on the table. She taught me to tie my shoes, to read my first book, to ride my bike. She was both mother and father, though the burden was heavy on her shoulders. I saw it in the way her back hunched when she thought no one was looking, in the lines that deepened on her face far too early. But what I remember most was the loneliness, not just mine, but hers. I would hear her crying sometimes, muffled behind her bedroom door. I wanted to go in, to comfort her, but I was only a boy. What could I possibly say? So I stayed in my room, hugging a pillow, pretending that maybe she wasn't crying at all. As I grew older, the whispers began. Children at school repeating what they had overheard from their parents. His dad left them. His mom wasn't enough to keep him around. Maybe his dad's in prison. Cruel speculation, tossed like stones, each one leaving a bruise I carried in silence. I learned to fight back not with fists, but with silence of my own. I built walls, thick and high, round the parts of me that hurt the most. But the truth always seeped through the cracks. The longing, the unanswered questions, the aching need to know who he was, where he had gone, and why that sometimes. I would sneak into my mother's closet when she wasn't home. In a showbox, tucked beneath blankets, she kept what little remained of him. A photograph of a man in a suit, smiling beside her in a time before I was born. A letter with his handwriting sharp, deliberate, almost cold. A few documents with his signature. I would trace the lines of his face with my fingers, trying to see myself in him. The curve of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the tilt of his smile. Did I look like him? Did I sound like him? Would he even recognize me if he saw me? One night, I asked her again. This time I was older, maybe 12, old enough to demand more than silence. Why did he leave? I asked. Why didn't he stay? She looked at me for a long time, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then she said softly, because some people choose themselves over everyone else. That answer hurt worse than the first. From then on, I stopped asking. The subject became a locked door in our house, one neither of us dared to open. But the questions never left me. They grew heavier as I did, pressing on my chest, shaping the man I was becoming. And now, sitting in that courtroom decades later, I realized the truth I had never dared to imagine. The man from the showbox. The man who chose himself. The man who left me behind. He had become a judge. A man sworn to uphold justice, though he had once failed to uphold the most basic duty of all. The duty to be a father. Silence has a way of growing roots. In our home, it spread like ivy creeping into the walls, weaving through the air, tangling around my heart until I could no longer tell where my mother's silence ended. And mine began. She never spoke his name. Not once, not in anger, not in longing, not even in passing. To her, the man who had given me life ceased to exist the day he walked out the door. But silence doesn't erase the past, it only makes it heavier, harder to carry, harder to breathe under. I tried to fill in the blanks myself. When teachers asked me about my father, I made up stories. He was away on business. He worked for the government. He was a soldier who never came home. Lies rolled off my tongue easier than the truth, because the truth was emptiness. And emptiness is impossible to explain. But lies don't last forever. One evening, when I was 15, I came home from school earlier than expected. My mother wasn't in the kitchen, where she usually was, cooking dinner with the radio humming softly. Instead, I heard a faint rustling from her bedroom. Curiosity pulled me closer. My footsteps soft on the carpet. Through the crack in the door, I saw her sitting on the floor, a showbox open before her. Its contents spread across her lap. She held a letter in her hands, trembling as though the words burned her skin. Her lips moved silently, as if she were mouthing them, though no sound escaped. I should have left. I should have given her privacy. But something in me froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For the first time, I saw her break not the quiet tears she thought I didn't hear at night, but a raw, open wound. She clutched that letter like it was both poison and salvation. When the floor creaked under my weight, her head snapped up. Our eyes locked. For a moment, neither of us breathed. Then she folded the letter quickly, shoved it back into the box, and closed the lid with shaking hands. "You're home early," she said, her voice rough, her cheeks streaked with tears. "What was that?" I whispered. "Nothing," she replied too quickly, wiping her face as though she could erase the truth along with the tears. "It's nothing." But I knew better. That night, while she showered, I returned to her room. My hands trembled as I opened the closet, pushed aside the blankets, and pulled out the showbox. Inside were the same fragments I had seen before the photograph. The old documents, but now there were more letters. Dozens of them, all in the same sharp, deliberate handwriting. I unfolded one. The words cut like knives. You made your choice, and I made mine. I cannot give up the life I've built for a mistake I made years ago. Do not contact me again. I dropped the letter as though it had bitten me. My stomach churned, my chest tight with rage. A mistake. That's what I was to him. Not a son, not a life, not flesh and blood, just a mistake. The shower stopped. Panic surged through me. I stuffed the letters back into the box, shoved it into the closet, and ran to my room, heart pounding. When my mother emerged, her hair damp, her eyes tired, she smiled at me weakly, as if nothing had happened. We never spoke of the showbox. Not that night, not ever. But from then on, her silence made sense. The man I had longed for, the man I had imagined waiting for me somewhere, hadn't just abandoned us. He had rejected us. Rejected me. Her silence wasn't about forgetting. It was about protection. She carried the burden alone because she knew the truth would crush me, and it did for years. I carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest. I told no one. Not friends, not family. I locked it away inside me, just as she had locked away those letters. But stones have a way of weighing you down until you can't breathe, and the heavier they get, the more dangerous the silence becomes. Now, sitting in the courtroom, watching the man who had written those words preside over the lives of others, I felt the weight pressing harder than ever. He was no longer just a ghost from a showbox. He was real. Flesh, blood, power, authority. A judge whose gavel could shape destinies. And yet he had once written me off as nothing more than a mistake. The silence my mother had built around me was breaking. And when it shattered, it would not be quiet. It would roar. The older I grew, the harder it became to live with the silence. My mother's showbox was locked away. But the words I had read that night carved themselves into my bones. A mistake. That's what he had called me. I carried those words everywhere through high school, through first loves, through the moments when I should have felt proud of myself, but instead felt hollow. I thought I could bury the truth as deeply as my mother had. For a while, I even convinced myself it might work. But blood has a way of resurfacing. No matter how hard you try to hide it, family ties leave traces, legal documents, whispers, shadows that follow you through time. That had happened one summer afternoon when I was 19. I was working part-time at the public library, shelving books and cleaning tables to save money for college. It was quiet, just the hum of the air conditioner and the soft shuffle of pages. A man came in, asking for public records. I pointed him toward the archives and, out of habit, lingered nearby to help. As he sorted through folders, I caught sight of a familiar name on one of the documents. My stomach dropped. It was his name. The same sharp, deliberate handwriting I had seen in those letters appeared on old court records. Judge Harold Whitman. I froze. My hands went numb, my breath shallow. It couldn't be, could it? I flipped through the files when the man wasn't looking. And there it was, his signature, repeated again and again, stamped with the seal of authority. Court cases, rulings, decisions that shaped lives. The man who had left me, the man who had abandoned my mother, wasn't just alive, he was thriving. He had climbed the ranks of the law, sat on the highest bench in our county, and built a career of respect and honor. A man who couldn't stay for his own child was now passing judgment on everyone else. The rage I felt in that moment burned through me like wildfire. But alongside it was something colder, sharper, resolve. I realized then that my story would never truly begin until I faced him. I needed answers. I needed him to see me not as a mistake, but as flesh and blood. Still, years passed before I acted. I went to college, got a job, built a life that was mine and mine alone. But the knowledge sat there, simmering, waiting for the right moment to erupt. That moment came when I saw the notice for this trial. It was a case that had gripped the community, high profile, controversial, the kind of trial that drew crowds and reporters. And at the center of it all, presiding over the case, was Judge Harold Whitman. Fate had placed him directly in my path, and I knew then what I had to do. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my colleagues, Not even my mother, who was still alive but older now, her body frail, her eyes dimmed by years of carrying secrets. She had spent her life protecting me from the truth. But I wasn't a child anymore. I didn't need protection. I needed justice, not the kind of justice handed down by gavels and juries. A different kind. The kind that comes when a father finally faces the son he abandoned. So I prepared. I gathered the letters, the documents, the fragments of my past. I studied his life, his rulings, his reputation. I learned the way he spoke, the way he wrote, the way he carried himself. And I waited for the day the courthouse doors would open and I could walk through them, not as a stranger, but as the living proof of everything he had tried to bury. Now, as I sat in the courtroom, only a few rows away, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. He thought his bloodlines were buried, that his past was dead and gone. But here I was, breathing, watching, waiting. The truth was no longer locked in a showbox. It was alive, sitting in the front row of his courtroom, ready to break free. And once it did, nothing, not his robe, not his gavel, not the walls of authority he had built around himself would protect him from it. The courtroom had its rhythm, a slow, deliberate dance of questions and answers, objections and rulings. To most, it looked like order. But to me, every movement was chaos barely hidden beneath the surface. I kept my eyes fixed on him, my father, my judge. He tried to act as if nothing was wrong, as if I was just another observer sitting quietly in the gallery. But I saw the cracks forming in his mask. At first, it was small things. He shuffled his notes longer than usual before beginning. His gavel hand trembled ever so slightly when he struck it against the block. He called the prosecutor by the wrong name, then corrected himself quickly, his voice sharp, irritated. The attorneys noticed, but they didn't know what it meant. They assumed fatigue, or distraction, or maybe even age. Only I knew the truth. His gaze kept drifting to me. Every time he looked up, his eyes searched the room and landed, inevitably, on mine. And every time, something in him faltered. It was as if my very presence unraveled him. I leaned back in my seat, folding my arms, pretending calm while inside my chest. My heart thundered. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to move. Just being there was enough to shake the foundation of the man who had once walked away without looking back. At one point, a witness gave testimony that should have been routine. Simple questions, simple answers. Yet when it came time for the judge to give instructions, his words stumbled. He paused too long, the silence stretching awkwardly. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and pressed on, but his voice had lost its steady edge. People whispered. They shifted in their seats. They looked at him with curiosity, maybe even doubt. A judge was supposed to be unshakable, unbiased, untouchable. But in that moment, he looked human, frighteningly human. I thought back to the letters, to the line that had burned itself into my memory. I cannot give up the life I've built for a mistake I made years ago. Was he thinking about that mistake now? Was he remembering the boy he had left behind, now grown and sitting in his courtroom? Did he wonder how long I had known? How much I had discovered? How much longer he could keep the truth buried? The prosecutor objected to a question, his voice firm. Sustained, my father said automatically, but his voice cracked on the word. The crack cut through me like lightning. I caught it. The attorneys caught it. The jury caught it. Everyone felt the hesitation, even if they didn't understand it. He gripped his gavel tighter, his knuckles white, his lips pressed into a thin line. I almost pitied him, almost, because I knew the truth he had tried so hard to suppress was pressing down on him now, heavier than the law books that lined his chambers. And I wasn't even speaking yet. As the day wore on, his mistakes grew more obvious. He forgot an instruction. He misquoted testimony. His voice rose, sharper than necessary, betraying irritation at the smallest things. The courtroom buzzed with unease. Reporters scribbled notes, sensing a story they couldn't quite place. And through it all, I sat there, silent, watching, a living ghost in his courtroom. He avoided my gaze more often as the hours passed, but when his eyes did meet mine, it was like looking into a mirror cracked down the middle. Regret stared back at me, fear, maybe even shame. For the first time, I realized something. He wasn't just afraid of being exposed. He was afraid of me. And that fear gave me power. As the gavel struck to end the day's proceedings, the sound echoed hollowly through the chamber. He rose quickly, almost too quickly, his robe swaying as he turned and disappeared behind the bench without so much as a glance at the room. But I saw the stiffness in his movements, the way his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had finally caught up to him. The courtroom emptied, voices low, questions whispered. But I stayed seated a little longer, staring at the empty bench. Tomorrow would come. The trial would continue, and with it, the mask he wore would keep breaking, piece by piece, until nothing was left. Family was supposed to be a safety net, a web of arms that caught you when the world grew too heavy. For me, that net had holes big enough to fall through. When my father left, he didn't just walk away from my mother and me. He walked away from everyone connected to us. His absence rippled outward like a stone tossed into still water, disturbing the balance of an entire family tree. My grandparents on my mother's side tried their best. They spoiled me when they could, slipping me candy, clapping the loudest at my school plays, buying me Christmas gifts even when money was tight. But beneath their smiles lingered a quiet bitterness. They never said it directly, but I heard the way they spoke about him when they thought I wasn't listening. He ruined her, my grandmother whispered once, her voice thick with tears. She was too young, my grandfather muttered back, the sound of his pipe tapping against the ashtray. She trusted the wrong man. Their words weren't daggers aimed at me, but they cut all the same. Because no matter how much I told myself I wasn't to blame, some part of me felt like the wound in our family was shaped like me. On my father's side, the silence was even louder. They vanished along with him. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who shared my blood but not my life. For years, I wondered if they even knew I existed, or if they had chosen to forget me the way he had. Once, when I was 13, I overheard my mother arguing on the phone. Her voice was sharp, strained. "He is your brother," she said. "Don't pretend he doesn't have a son." I crept closer, pressing my ear to the door. "He made his choices," the voice on the other end replied, cold as stone. "We can't be dragged into this. That's what I was, a burden too heavy for anyone to carry. A secret best left buried. Holidays became reminders of everything we had lost. Thanksgiving dinners were smaller, quieter. Christmas mornings were bittersweet, filled with smiles stretched thin over the ache of what wasn't there. Every empty chair at the table felt like an accusation, a reminder of the fracture that had split us down the middle. As I grew older, I learned to hide my resentment behind jokes and half smiles. But inside, I carried the weight of generations of disappointment. My family didn't just lose a father, they lost a brother, a son, an uncle. The man who should have tied us all together had become the knot that unraveled us instead. And yet, despite the damage, his shadow lingered. Even in his absence, he had power. He dictated the conversations we didn't have, the names we didn't speak, the gatherings that ended before they began. He wasn't there, but he was everywhere. Sometimes late at night, I would imagine what it would be like if he came back, not to me, but to all of us. Would my grandparents forgive him? Would his siblings open their doors again? Would the family torn apart by his choices ever find a way to piece itself back together? Those were the dreams of a child. By the time I became an adult, I knew better. Families don't mend themselves with apologies decades too late. Wounds like ours scar over, they don't heal. But sitting in that courtroom, watching him preside over strangers' fates while ours had been shattered by his absence, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been left behind in his wake. My mother, my grandparents, the family who had chosen silence over confrontation. I wasn't just carrying my own pain into that courtroom. I was carrying theirs to Dot, and whether he liked it or not, he would have to face it. The next morning, the courthouse loomed over me like a cathedral, its stone columns stretched upward, proud and immovable, a monument to justice, or at least the illusion of it. I stood outside for a long time, my breath clouding in the cool air, debating whether to walk in at all. I told myself I could still leave. I could vanish into the city, back to the quiet life I had built for myself. No one here knew who I really was. No one expected me to carry this burden. It would be so easy to slip away, to let him keep his carefully constructed life intact. But then I thought of my mother, of the lines etched into her face from years of carrying silence that wasn't hers to bear. I thought of my grandparents, who swallowed their anger with every holiday dinner. I thought of the boy I used to be, sitting on the porch waiting for headlights that never came. If I walked away now, I wouldn't just be protecting him. I would be betraying all of them and myself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavier than the day before. Reporters lingered in the back rows, pens ready, sensing tension they couldn't name. The attorneys wore their fatigue like armor. The jury avoided one another's eyes. And at the center of it all, my father sat stiffly, his robe immaculate, his hands folded tightly on the bench as if clinging to control. I took my seat again, close enough to see the fine tremor in his fingers. When his gaze flicked toward me, I held it, unflinching. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes: recognition, fear, maybe even guilt. But then the mask slid back into place, that I wondered if he was fighting the same battle I was. Was he debating whether to acknowledge me? Did he lie awake at night, imagining what would happen if the truth came out? Or was he still the man from those letters, the one who dismissed me as nothing more than a mistake? The attorneys droned on, their words a blur. I heard fragments: objection, sustained, inadmissible, but none of it mattered. The real trial was happening in silence, between him and me. My chest tightened as I imagined standing up, my voice breaking through the air. This man is not just your judge. He is my father. The thought of saying it electrified me. I pictured the gasps, the reporters scrambling for their notebooks, the jury's wide eyes. I imagined his face, stripped of its authority, forced to confront the past he had buried. But another vision came just as quickly. My mother, her voice trembling as she said, "Some people choose themselves over everyone else." She had spent her whole life shielding me from the cruelty of that truth. Would I be dishonoring her by dragging it into the light now? The weight of the past pressed down on me, threatening to crush me where I sat. Every choice felt dangerous. Silence meant continuing the cycle, carrying the burden alone until it ate me alive. Truth meant destruction not just of his reputation, but of whatever fragile balance my family had left. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing my breath steady. The truth was coming, whether I spoke it or not. It hung in the air between us, heavy, waiting. And once it broke free, there would be no turning back. When I opened my eyes, he was staring at me again. Not the cold, dismissive glance of a man looking at a stranger. Not the authoritative glare of a judge silencing a disruption. Something else. It was the look of a man haunted by a ghost he could no longer ignore. And in that moment, I realized the silence wasn't mine to carry anymore. The weight belonged to him. I had promised myself I would stay silent. I told myself that watching him unravel from the shadows would be enough. But fate has a way of dragging the truth out, whether we're ready or not. It happened on the third day of the trial. The prosecution had called witness after witness, their testimonies painting a picture of guilt and betrayal. I wasn't paying much attention, not to their words, at least. I was watching him. Always him. The judge sat straighter that morning, his robe crisp, his expression severe. He was trying harder now, rebuilding the mask, regaining control. But the tremor was still there, faint but persistent, in the way his gavel tapped a beat too quickly, in the way his gaze darted toward me even when he tried not to look. Then the prosecutor cleared his throat and said something that made my stomach drop. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to call an additional witness who was present at the time of the incident." The judge frowned, shuffling papers. "Name." The prosecutor turned and pointed toward me. For a moment, the world tilted. My vision blurred, my ears roared. My name echoed through the courtroom, foreign and heavy, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The judge froze, his lips parting in shock before he quickly composed himself. "You may approach," he said. Though his voice was tighter than before, my legs felt like lead as I stood, every eye in the courtroom drilling into me. The jury leaned forward, the reporters scribbled furiously, and I walked the long, impossible path to the witness stand. Each step echoed like thunder. When I sat down, the bailiff swore me in. My voice wavered as I repeated the oath, my hand trembling above the Bible. Across the room, my father watched me with an intensity that burned. For the first time in decades, He had no power over me. I wasn't the boy he abandoned. I wasn't a mistake tucked into silence. I was here, in his courtroom, ready to speak. The prosecutor began with simple questions: where I had been, what I had seen. My answers were calm, factual, steady enough that my nerves started to fade. But then came the question that cracked everything open. Do you recognize the defendant? The prosecutor asked. Yes, I said. Can you explain how? I hesitated. My mouth went dry, my chest constricting. I could feel the judge's eyes on me, boring into my soul, pleading without words. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, I spoke. I recognize more than just the defendant, I said softly, my voice trembling. I recognize the man presiding over this trial. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Pens scratched violently across paper. The prosecutor froze, his brow furrowed. I'm sorry, could you clarify? I looked straight at the bench, at the man who had once called me a mistake. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, I thought he might stop me, shout, object, strike his gavel until the sound drowned out my words. But he didn't. He just sat there, frozen, as if chained by his own silence. I've known him, I said, my voice stronger now. Not as a judge, not as a stranger, but as someone who shaped my life in ways this court could never imagine. The jury exchanged confused glances. The attorneys shifted uneasily. Reporters leaned so far forward their pens nearly touched the floor. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and desperate. The witness will confine his testimony to matters relevant to the case. His voice cracked on the last word, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Relevance, I whispered, my eyes locked on his. Sometimes, Your Honor, the truth itself is the most relevant thing of all. The room was silent, but it wasn't the calm of order. It was the silence of breath held, of hearts pounding, of people leaning in, desperate to catch every word. The judge's gavel still echoed faintly in the air, but his command had fallen flat. Authority was slipping through his fingers, and everyone felt it. I kept my eyes locked on his. You want me to limit my words, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady now, fueled by years of silence breaking. But I can't do that anymore. Not when the truth has been buried this long. Gasps rippled through the room. The jury whispered. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. The reporters' pens moved so quickly it sounded like rainfall. My father's face was a mask cracking by the second. His lips pressed thin, his knuckles white against the bench. For the first time, the man who had built a life on control looked powerless. I grew up without a father, I continued, my voice rising. I grew up watching my mother break her back to keep food on the table, to raise me alone. I grew up listening to whispers about a man who had walked away, a man who chose himself over his own family. The prosecutor shifted nervously. Your Honor, this testimony. Sit down, the judge snapped, his voice sharp, but it trembled with panic. The prosecutor froze, stunned into silence. I leaned forward, my words aimed directly at him now, cutting through the courtroom like knives. And that man is sitting right there, not the defendant, you. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, the rustle of bodies shifting. The jury's mouths fell open, their eyes darting between us. Reporters nearly dropped their pens in their scramble to capture every syllable. Even the bailiff froze, his hand hovering uncertainly near his holster as if the truth itself were a weapon. The judge, my father, slammed the gavel again and again, each strike weaker than the last. Order, he barked. This is irrelevant. Irrelevant. But no one believed him anymore. The truth had been spoken, and it hung heavy in the air, undeniable. I stood taller in the witness box, my chest heaving. Irrelevant? Tell them, then. Tell this court why you recognized me the moment I walked in. Tell them why you froze. Tell them why you can't look at me without seeing the life you abandoned. His hand shook so violently that the gavel slipped, clattering against the bench. The sound echoed like a confession. The jury stared at him, wide-eyed. The attorneys whispered frantically to their clients. The gallery buzzed with disbelief. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was hollow, broken. This is not the place, he whispered. No, I shot back, my voice rising with years of buried pain. This is exactly the place. A courtroom, where truth is supposed to matter. where justice is supposed to be done. How can you sit there and judge others when you've never faced the judgment of your own choices? His face crumpled, the mask shattering. For a moment, he looked less like a judge and more like an old man haunted, cornered, unraveling under the weight of everything he had buried. The reporters were already on their feet. Cameras clicked. The world was watching. And there it was, the revelation, laid bare before strangers, before the law, before the very institution he had used as a shield. Judge Harold Whitman was not just a man of authority. He was my father, the man who had left me, the man who had written me off as a mistake, the man whose silence had carved scars into an entire family. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Chaos is louder than any gavel. The moment the words left my mouth, the courtroom fractured. Reporters lunged forward, pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing like lightning. Jurors whispered to one another, their expressions torn between disbelief and pity. The attorneys tried to restore order, their voices sharp, but no one was listening anymore. The truth had stolen the air from the room, and everyone was gasping for what remained. The judge, my father, sat frozen. His face was pale, his eyes darting between me and the crowd, like a cornered animal searching for an escape that didn't exist. The robe that once made him untouchable now looked like nothing more than fabric. Draped over a man stripped bare, the bailiff shouted for silence, but the noise only swelled. People craned their necks to see me, to see him, to connect the pieces of the story unraveling in real time. I sat there, heart pounding, a strange calm washing over me. For years, I had carried this truth in silence, choking on it, burying it so deep I thought it would kill me. And now it was out. The world knew, but with the release came fear. What had I done? The prosecutor slammed his papers on the table. Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. We request an immediate recess. His voice was sharp, but I caught the tremor in it. He, too, understood the gravity of what had just happened. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a scandal. My father's lips parted, but no words came. He gripped the bench with both hands, as if the wood itself might keep him upright. Finally, in a voice barely audible, he whispered, "Recess granted." He rose, but his legs shook. For the first time, the man who had towered above me all my life looked small, fragile, mortal. The courtroom erupted as he disappeared behind the door. Reporters shouted questions at me. Is it true? How long have you known? What does this mean for the case? Their voices blurred into noise. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I felt eyes on me from every corner of the room, curiosity, judgment, pity. Strangers dissecting my life with every glance. I had wanted the truth to set me free, but now I wasn't sure if it would chain me down instead. I left the stand slowly, my legs weak. The bailiff didn't stop me. No one did. I slipped into the hallway, the noise of the courtroom fading behind me. The marble floor gleamed beneath my feet, cold and hard, reflecting a version of myself I barely recognized. Outside, the press had already gathered. Cameras clicked, microphones shoved into my face. Questions rained down like bullets. What's your relationship to the judge? Is he really your father? Did he know you were here today? I pushed past them, the flashes blinding, the voices dizzying. The truth had escaped its cage, and now it belonged to the world. I found a quiet corner at the end of the hall and leaned against the wall, my chest heaving. My hands trembled, my body buzzing with adrenaline and regret. Was this justice, or was it destruction? I thought of my mother, of her fragile body, her tired eyes. She had carried this silence to protect me. Would she see my revelation as courage or betrayal? I thought of my family, torn apart for decades. Would this truth bring healing, or would it rip the wounds open wider than ever? And I thought of him, the man behind the bench, the man stripped of his robe and authority, left with nothing but the past he had tried to bury. For the first time, I wondered if I had not only exposed him, but broken him. The weight of the past was gone from my chest, but it wasn't freedom I felt. It was something heavier, something I didn't have a name for yet. The trial would resume. The world would keep asking questions, but nothing would ever be the same again. The courthouse emptied slower that afternoon. Reporters lingered outside, their voices echoing down the marble corridors. The jury shuffled out with wide eyes, whispering to one another. The attorneys walked stiffly, their faces tight with unease. I stayed behind. Something in me knew this wasn't finished. The trial might resume tomorrow. The headlines would spread tonight. But what mattered most wasn't happening in the courtroom anymore. It was happening behind closed doors, between him and me. The bailiff gave me a wary glance, but didn't stop me as I walked toward the judge's chambers. My footsteps echoed in the silence, steady but heavy, like the heartbeat of a man walking toward his fate. I paused outside the door, the wood towering over me, polished and dark. For a moment, I almost turned away. Then I knocked. "Comin'," a voice rasped from inside. I opened the door and stepped in. The room was dim, lit only by the weak afternoon light filtering through half-closed blinds. He sat behind his desk, the black robe draped carelessly over the back of his chair. Without it, he looked older, smaller, like a man, not a judge. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, decades in the making. His eyes met mine, and I saw something I had never seen before: fear stripped bare, mingled with shame. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't think you'd ever find me. I wasn't looking for you," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands shook at my sides. "I was looking for the truth." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "And now you've found it." I took a step closer. "Why?" The word cracked from me like thunder. "Why did you leave? Why did you let her raise me alone? Why did you write those letters, call me a mistake?" His face crumpled. He pressed his hands together, as though praying, but no prayer could fix the years between us. I was young, selfish, afraid. I thought walking away would be easier than facing what I had done. And when I built this life, this career, I convinced myself that silence was safer than truth. Safer for who? I demanded. For you. Because it destroyed us. It destroyed her. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he blinked them back. "I know." His voice was raw now, stripped of authority. "And I have lived with that regret every day. Every ruling, every sentence I passed, it all reminded me of the one I had abandoned." I stood there, torn apart. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, yelling, accusing, maybe even striking him. Instead, all I felt was exhaustion. The anger had burned for so long it had turned to ash inside me. "Do you want forgiveness?" I asked quietly. He bowed his head. "I don't deserve it." Silence filled the room again. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with voices, but in here it was just us, father and son. Bound by blood, divided by years. I should have walked out. I should have left him to his shame. But something held me in place. Something I couldn't name. Finally, he raised his eyes. "Let me do one thing right," he whispered. "Let me step down. Let me tell the truth myself before the world drags it out. I'll resign tomorrow. I'll admit everything." I stared at him, my heart heavy. This was the man I had hated for so long. The man who had abandoned me, rejected me, erased me. And yet, in this broken figure, I saw something else. Not redemption, not yet, but the faint shadow of a father who, for the first time, wasn't running. I turned toward the door. My voice was low, almost a whisper. "If you mean it, then maybe this isn't the end." He nodded slowly, his shoulders shaking. "Maybe it's a beginning." I left without another word. The hallway stretched before me, bright and blinding after the dimness of his chambers. The world outside was waiting, the reporters, the chaos, the storm. But inside me, something had shifted. The truth had torn us apart. But maybe, just maybe, it had given us the chance to start again. And then, as I reached the end of the hall, a crash sounded behind me, a chair tipping, a heavy thud. Shouts followed, panicked, urgent. I spun around, but before I could move, a bailiff rushed past me toward the chambers. My father, the judge. The man I had finally confronted was on the floor, his body still, his hand clutching his chest. The twist of fate was cruel and undeniable. After a lifetime of silence, after the revelation, after the chance of a fragile new beginning, our story had ended in a single heartbeat.